Morning, Rethink Church. It's so good to see you guys. A couple of announcements for you this morning. If you are new or visiting with us this morning, we would love to connect with you. And we have a gift for you guys just for being here. So come find me after the service over at Guest Services. It's out in the lobby by the One Cup Cafe. Or you can connect digitally by texting the word HERE to 219-233-2311. As you know, Christmas is coming up, and we are going to be having a Christmas Eve service. And so that will take place on Christmas Eve at 7 p.m. So we'd love to have you guys there. We will have nursery open, and then kids will be in service with an activity pack. So we were excited to have you guys come for that. And then lastly, I just want to thank you guys for giving to the vision and mission of Rethink Church. In the last week, we were able to raise money to sponsor some kids for Christmas. And so we have sponsored 4 children. So we went out and got gifts this week, thanks to your generosity. And if you want to be a part of what we're doing with that, you can also, if you have time, stay after the service and help us wrap those presents. Those will go out to the families then this week so that they can have a great Christmas. So thank you guys for your generosity in that. And if you do want to give to the vision and mission of Rethink Church, we have 2 ways you can do so. You can either give online at rethinkchurch.cc, or you can give in person. We have that black box by the door. It's great seeing you guys this morning. So lean in as Mark comes up and shares our sermon this morning.
Church. My name is Mark, I'm the pastor of our church, and I know we had a few weeks different, put it that way. So thanks for being flexible, and I knew that as soon as we came down with sickness, we're like, hey, we shouldn't have church just because we should, right? So we just followed the protocol and did all that fun stuff. So, and we are in week 2 of Missing Peace. So we're talking about the promise from the angels that when Jesus was going to show up, that he was going to bring peace on this earth. And last week we talked about that maybe the angels were just as delusional as the beauty pageant contestants. That we want world peace, right? And we think about this all the time. We say this all the time, but if you just look at the world, does it really look peaceful? Or maybe they have a different mindset of what peace is and what we're anticipating as well. And so we talked about last week. That's one of those aspects that we just need to realize that I think God is actually putting this idea of peace on this earth onto his disciples. And the responsibility that we get to carry this peace and this message of Jesus with us is that we get to announce this as well as his followers. And so last week we talked about that. This week we're going to talk about the difference or the challenge. I'll put it this way, that have you ever noticed, especially in 2021, that there's a lot of people that are challenging, it's really challenged to love them. You kind of want to throat punch people more in the last 365 days, right? Maybe it's just me, and I'm probably the wrong, I'll just put it that way. I'm probably not the best pastor, I want to throat punch you, but I haven't done it yet, right? It's like a recovery thing, right? And so, there are people, just like yesterday we were at a tournament, a wrestling tournament. People in the crowd were challenging to love them because, they're yelling stupid things out there. And I'm like, you're wrong. Be quiet. Sit down. Shut up. But you have to say it in a loving way, right? Or you just choose to ignore them, right? That's one of those aspects. And so part of this process is that, I think 2021 has made people very challenging to love. And a lot of us, we've kind of isolated ourselves. We've kind of created this nice little bubble of well, these are the people I like. And this is what it's like for me to be around them. And so we just kind of act like a nice little moat for them. And we have this I call it an unholy trinity. We've had things that we've had to avoid in dinners and family gatherings and stuff like that. We've always known that we should avoid politics and that we should avoid religion, right? Well, now we have this third one that we have to avoid, and that's the idea of science. Right? You bring the idea of science, and all of a sudden, everyone's opinion about what science really is. And have you noticed that, since COVID, everyone is a scientist now? Because everyone's watched YouTube, and everyone has read a blog, and everyone's listened to a podcast, and everyone's done all these other things. And all of a sudden that makes everyone an expert. And all the idea, just take the idea of masks or vaccines and stuff like that, it's become such a a weaponized version of everything, right? Like you can notice what kind of political agenda they have if they wear a mask or not. And if they do, then they're, oh, we know what that kind of party is. And if they don't, well then they must be one of those crazy people, right? Like we have all these different ways of weaponizing these things. And we've turned everything a way to divide us, even the idea of religion. If you truly love your neighbor, you're going to get vaccinated. If you truly love your neighbor, you're going to wear that mask. But if you truly have faith, then you don't really need a vaccine. Have you heard this argument, or is it just me? And if you truly have faith, then you don't need to worry about the mask and all this other stuff, and you can't take my religious freedom away because I worship Jesus over everything else, and you can't tell me what the mandates are and all this other stuff. It's just this way of completely dividing us over and over and over again. And some of us, we've fallen right into it. Since the beginning of COVID, I've been part of this group of pastors. And we get together once a month. And so mine, because I teach, mine is at 6 a.m. on a Zoom call, which is not a great way to start your day. But it's with 40 other pastors in this region. We pray for each other. We get involved in stuff. And this last week was this last one that I did. And we've been part of this study group for a while, just kind of giving the status of where we are as a church and where we are as a pastor and that kind of stuff. And then it's a Barna group, so we're constantly just getting information back from them. And this latest report is the last 6 months, and the status of pastors, I don't know how to call it, the satisfaction status, if you will, a Yelp review type thing, has plummeted. We endured the first version of COVID, but then I was well, now what? And then all of a sudden, the status just plummeted. And they talked about how in the last, the prediction in 18 months, that there will be a mass exodus of pastors. Of just a combination of retirement, and then we just can't keep up with things. And then the expectations from churches and the expectations from the communities and all this other, and denominational leaders. And it's they're anticipating one of the greatest exodus and vacuums, in a sense, of pastors who are just we're done. You guys remember in the 1990s when OJ was being chased by all the police? They showed this meme. It's OJ in the white Bronco, and then there's 700 policemen behind him. And they showed the meme and they said, this is basically what it looks like to be a pastor. You're the white Bronco, and you have all these policemen just trying to chase you as all the expectations. And we have all these things, and then they talk about how this is impacting our marriages, this is impacting family units, this is impacting communities. And it's one of those realities that it was a sobering moment for me, thinking, okay, we've got to start praying through this. We've got to start leading through this differently. And it's not just necessarily what do I get out of it, right? But more of how can we share the peace of Jesus, the peace on this earth during this kind of season? And what does it look like for you and I to step into this moment? Because I think we have this probably 2.5 years now of just simple disappointment after disappointment. And let me ask you this: how many of us have actually had control over the things we've been disappointed in? Have we had the control of the shutdowns? Have we had control of if you're at home teaching your kids, and all of a sudden if you've did all that and then you now endure all that? Now, how many of us have had control over the vaccine mandates? All these other expectations that we have. And it's just this level of disappointment after disappointment. It's this perpetual disappointment, and you have very little control. And we as Americans kind of like our control, don't we? We kind of want to have our own, we control our destiny, that kind of thing. And so we tend to typically forget about, resist about it. And then you add this level of, if you're constantly, disappointed and you have very little control, then you're going to try to find ways, not really try, but you're going to find ways to be offended. Have you noticed this? That, somebody's going to say something or do something that's going to offend you. And we can live in a constant state of being offended, or you can just simply say, yeah, there's this level of offense. And I will say this, Let me just read it very quickly. If you are on the continual search to be offended, you will always find what you're looking for. And it's so easy to find people like that, right? You are constantly looking to be offended. I used the phrase in my class this week, like to master a task, like to do this. And this one student was like, "That's a racist statement." And I was like, "Whoa, explain to me." And they're like, "You can't use the word master around us because you're white." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And they're like, "I was like talking about becoming an expert at this or anything like that." We talked about, just accomplishing tasks and having a degree, a master's degree. And they said, "That's a racist degree." And I was like, "You need to have like a wake-up call. You're 13 years old. How about you shut up?" Right? And so my level of patience since having COVID is like plummeted even more. I really had a ton of patience in the beginning part, so there's that. The reality of it is, if you are constantly wanting to be looking for offense, you're going to find it. You will find it in any and everything that you can find, right? And that's just one of those realities that we have to kind of put ourselves into perspective of like, what is Jesus actually talking about when the angels proclaimed, or what were the angels talking about when they proclaimed that Jesus is going to bring peace on this earth? And so we're going to step into this for next week, for this week, to kind of set the stage of what does it actually look like for you and I to live in such a way that we don't get offended and that we offer peace instead of offense in a world that constantly is trying to divide us. Let's pray real quickly, and then we'll get into this. Jesus, thanks for this day. And Jesus, thanks that you offer us peace instead of offense. That you chose to have peace and chose to be peace. And like we talked about last week, Jesus, you leave us your peace. And so, Jesus, I pray that you would allow us to pick up your peace and your spirit in that. And to overlook offenses and to overlook certain things. We love you, Jesus. Genuinely pray this. Amen. So we're going to look at Romans chapter 12. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. But let me just set up the book of Romans for us really quickly as you're getting there. Romans is a book written by a guy named Paul. And somehow the message of Jesus and the kingdom of Jesus was like announced to him, the city of Rome, I should say, before Paul gets to them. And so there's a group of Christians, and they've been there for a while, a group of Gentile and Jewish Christians. But somewhere during history time, if you know your history, there was a huge fire in Rome, and this emperor kicked all the Jewish people out because the Jewish people refused to worship the Roman gods. And so they just assumed, because this fire happened, that the Roman gods were mad at the Jewish people because they would not worship all the pantheon of gods. And so the Jewish people, any Jewish person that was kicked out of the city limits. And so now this left the group of Gentile Christians to worship God on their own. And you can imagine, before this fire took place, the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians worshiped together. But they worshiped differently, right? So there's all this conflict of like kosher laws and should you like have head coverings and all this other stuff, and they worked this stuff out together. But then for several years, the Jewish Christians were outside of the city, the Roman city. And now you have the Gentile Christians kind of worshiping together. And then eventually, the Jewish people were allowed back into the city limits of Rome. And now Paul is noticing that they're worshiping not together, but separate. This is a whole lot easier to stay separate. And Paul's like, no, this is not how this should be done. We should actually work this thing out together. And so he's trying to get them to come together. There's a network of about 16 to 20 house churches, and he's like, come together and let's do this. And so this is where he writes the letter of Romans. So here's Romans chapter 12, verse 14 is what we'll be. Here's what he says. Bless those who persecute you. Bless, do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay evil for anyone for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. That's Romans chapter 12, verse 14 through 18. Now, he says this very clearly, bless those who persecute you. The word bless here in the Greek it's eulogio, which basically means to speak well of, to wish the best upon them, right? And so you have this idea that it's easy to do that for people that we like. It's very easy for me to think about, especially other Notre Dame fans. I will bless you all day long, right? I will not bless, or I'll struggle at it, to bless LSU fans right now, right? Or USC fans or Michigan fans. I can't even really think about saying bless you, Michigan fans. But it is what it is, right? Like it's one of those things. It's a struggle point for some of us to kind of think that through. But what Paul is asking us to do is to bless those who persecute you. Not just have difference of opinions, not just people who are different than you, but those who are like even just different. And I think some of us, we tend to have this idea that when we see somebody who, let's say somebody's driving down US 30 going 90 miles an hour and they cut you off, don't you secretly wish that they get caught? Don't you secretly wish, maybe you have an accident, but not necessarily kill anyone, but just get hurt, damage their car? That would be awesome. There's part of each of us that all kind of want that, right? Like I secretly want Brian Kelly to fail at LSU. I just kind of secretly want that. I think it would be an awesome way for him to go out and say, yep, go do this. And then he just has to retire because he sucks as a coach after this moment, right? Like that would be my secret ambition. But what does Paul ask us to do? Not to secretly hope that they get caught, they get theirs and all that, but to actually bless them. To actually speak well of them. And not just once. This is in the language here, this is a present imperative, meaning that we don't just do it once, but we do it and then we constantly do it. We do it over and over and over and over again. That you and I, as followers of Jesus, we should continually bless those who are continual problems to us. Think about that. We should constantly be a blessing to those people who are constantly a problem for you and I. This is what Paul is asking for us to do. And I think in our world today, that instead of looking for ways to divide, that you and I, as the followers of Jesus, it's our responsibility to carry this message of blessing and peace, and for us to carry this out and say, okay, where the world wants to divide us, what would happen if we actually brought people together? What would actually happen if we stepped in and where people are easily just offended, we could actually offer peace by speaking well of? Does that mean we have to lie about them? Really, probably not. But can you find something to speak well about them about? Can you find something good, right? Like, it's not like every human being is 100% horrible. There has to be something that we can find that we can have a common goal in there, right? And it seems like it's almost impossible to do this, but like all things are possible for Christ. If we're going to pull a verse out of context, let's do it. Right? And then let's do it to make a point. And so let's do this and let's actually make this such a way that we can step into something and say, okay, Jesus, where you chose to constantly turn the other cheek, where you constantly chose to find something good to speak of, you did it. And so shouldn't we step into that model as well? Here's what Romans chapter 12, verse 1 says this. Paul is once again saying this, he says, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And it's this phrase, living sacrifice, it's like an oxymoron in a sense, right? Most sacrifices go well when the person is not living, or the object's not living. What Paul is asking us to do is to step in as being living in sacrifice. Now, when we talk about worship, it's not just songs that we sing, it's actually the lifestyle that we live. What Paul's asking for you and I to do is to put this idea of getting what we deserve and putting that on the altar. And living sacrifice also means that you could just get up when you want to. What Jesus is asking for us to do here is to say, okay, I'm going to set on the altar, and Jesus, where my pride is and where I want my selfish ambitions and all that, I'm going to let that just get put to death. And I'm going to allow this to just be my act of sacrifice and my act of worship to you. Where I want to get my revenge, I'm just going to wait. Where I want to lash out, I'm going to put this on the altar, Jesus. And I'm going to turn the other cheek. I'm going to find something to speak well of and to bless and all that. And the only reason we can really do that as followers of Jesus is because eventually it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the more we step into this and the more we do this, it's like a little bit unnatural, yes, but it's this reality that Jesus lives in me and that I've allowed my selfish ambition. We talk about the three enemies of our soul. That we have the world, which is the society, culture, and all that. We have our flesh, which is our own selfish desire, and we have the enemy, the Satan, and all that. And these three enemies of the soul are just constantly attacking us, and they want to erode any form of peace that we have, anything of Jesus that we have in our lives, just kind of erode that away in our lives. But the more that we step into this and say, okay, I'm literally going to sit on the altar of sacrifice here, Jesus. And will you just take all my selfish ambition and just kind of kill it? And will you live in my place? Like, that's the process that we go through here. Romans chapter 12, verse 16 says this. Paul says, live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, and do not be conceited. And then we tend to complicate what does it really mean to be proud, what does it mean to be conceited. But in the Greek, here's what it really means. Don't be proud, and don't be conceited. We don't really complicate that, right? But some of us, we live in this, and we just tend to be proud and conceited. We try to overcomplicate things, and what it really just means is learn how to be humble. And learn how to not be arrogant. And one of the ways that we can kind of explain this, I was reading an article earlier this year, and we tend to judge other people by their actions, but we want to be judged by our intentions. If you only knew my backstory, if you only knew all the reasons why I couldn't do what I was going to say I was going to do, but I really had the great intentions, didn't I? But then when it comes to other people, no way. You said you're going to do it, and you chose not to do it, right? What if we actually just started allowing other people to have the same grace that we would judge people based on their intentions, not necessarily their actions? And what would it look like for us to offer grace in that regard? Here's the reality of it. Jesus did not tell us to be right. He told us to be beloved. We tend to try to be right all we can. We try to just offer as many explanations and try to just offer all this other stuff in our place. And Jesus is like, whoa, pause. I ask you to be loving, not necessarily right. I've had to learn this the hard way time and time again, where just even with my own family, I could win several arguments and prove all of my family members wrong, or I could actually fight for a relationship instead of just trying to be right. And so part of this process is you and I are going to have to learn. Can we be loving and right? And if we have to choose one, what does Jesus ask us to choose? To be loving. He doesn't really care if you won that argument about what the podcast said and all that, and what vaccines really mean and all. Who cares? Choose to be loving. If you have to choose one, choose to be loving. That's what he would ask us to do, right? I've heard more and more of this in the last year and a half or so, that you can't be a liberal and be a Christian. Or you can't be a conservative and love Jesus. I've heard more, I remember in the early 2000s when we lived in Florida, and during another election year, it was very divisive, but I feel like this year and a half or 2 years has just been on steroids. And more people have chosen to make their claims in this. And my response every year or every time I hear this is, I think you have a small worldview, and you need to actually wake up. That you actually need to start seeing things in a different way. And stop listening just to respond to other people, But what would happen if we actually listened to understand the other side? To actually hear, okay, you have a different political view? Explain to me how can I understand your viewpoint, right? And I know we typically tend to avoid politics, and we don't really get into any politics here in church, because it's church, not a political rally. There's that. But there's this reality that I think some of us, we need to learn how to sit across the table from like having coffee with somebody and just hear their vantage point. And stop drawing these lines in the sand that divide us more and more. But actually would allow us to have difference of opinions, difference of impacts, and stuff like that. And if you can't see the perspective, then your impact will always be limited. If you can't see the other person's perspective and hear their vantage point, where they came from, and all that, then your impact will always be limited. Sorry, let me just give you another. Let me pull this one up. Ephesians chapter 4. Paul writes this. He says this: "Be patient with one another, making allowances for each other's faults because of your love." And here, I just want to point this out. Each of us have a calling. And our calling is too important and our life is too short to try to be offended by other things. To constantly look for things that are going to be offensive. You have such a great destiny. You have such a great calling on your life. Don't get tripped up on something that's small and insignificant just because you want to find something to be offensive. Don't constantly look for that. Imagine if Jesus was just finding ways to be offended. Imagine if he was like Peter, all you did was like put your foot in your mouth and you didn't like pay attention to it. Imagine if he was like Matthew, all you did was take notes, you didn't pay attention to his sermons. Right? Or like, hey, Thomas, all you did was doubt me. You never actually came and worshiped me. Instead, what he did was he would look at these things, he would call people out for these things, but he would also restore them. Like he just simply spent time restoring and building that relationship up and choosing not to be offended by all these small little things. Here's the reality of it. Being offended is inevitable. You're going to be offended by something, right? But living in offense is a choice. If you're constantly looking for something to be offended by, you're going to find what you're looking for. And I think some of us, we tend to just step right into it, and I would just encourage us, find ways to overlook an offense. Find ways to rise over it. Here's what Proverbs chapter 19, verse 11 says this: "A person's wisdom yields patience, but it's the one's glory to overlook an offense." And overlooking an offense is not the same as pretending it didn't happen. It's not the same. The Hebrew word for overlook is avor, which means to kind of rise over it. Like an eagle rises over a treetop, right? Imagine if a bird is flying and is like, "I do not like this tree," and just chooses to fly right into it. Is that going to end well for the bird? Not really. But what does the eagle do? Rises over it. This is what the author of Proverbs is asking you and I to do. Do not get tripped up on it, but to rise over it. And there's something beautiful about this, right? We choose to pass right over it. We choose to fly over it. Someone makes a passive-aggressive comment. Do you have to get involved in that? Or could you rise over it? Right? Imagine if your spouse was complaining about the way you chew your gum, the way you put your dishes away, the way you do all this other stuff, and you choose not to get offended by that, but you choose to what? Rise over it. This is one of those aspects that we can do this. You can either choose to get into a fight with your spouse about the way that she complains or he complains about all the other things about you, but you could also just choose to rise over it, right? This is one of those things. And we tend to get involved in some of the weirdest arguments as humans, right? But what we should actually do is rise over these things. We should actually just kind of find ways to get over that and then move on. And where the world is trying to divide us, I think God is trying to draw us together. This is why he doesn't ask us to live in isolation, but to actually draw people together and to bring things together. Is it going to be easy? Not all the time. But in marriage, we know this, that if you choose to win an argument, you may lose the marriage. But if you choose to fight and protect the actual relationship, then the arguments kind of tend to go away, right? Like, the point of the arguments, like the petty, like, hey, your socks are in front of the trash, or the laundry basket instead of in the laundry basket. Yeah, that's fine, we'll get there eventually, right? But if you choose to argue and protect the actual relationship, then it tends to just kind of get overlooked. But for some reason, when it comes to like living differently with diversity and living intentional and stuff like this, we tend to just find ways to be offended. We look for ways to do this. Here's what Paul says in Romans chapter 12. If it's possible, as long as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. I just want to say this again, that you have a calling on your life, and your life is too short, your calling is too important to be offended by small, insignificant things. Choose not to be offended by these things. So I have a couple questions for you. We're going to put the timer back up when we get into this. But here's the first question for you. Do you know what your calling is? Not what your job is, but your actual calling. Do you know what that actually is in your life? And are you willing to stay on focus for your calling rather than just simply get involved in some weird, insignificant argument? The second one is this. How is overlooking offense not the same as pretending it didn't happen? How do you actually live that part out? It's not like overlooking the offense is rising above it. It's not pretending it didn't happen. So we're going to put the timer up. I'm just going to give you guys moments to kind of pause and process these couple questions for you. And then we'll wrap this up, okay? All right, well, I know we probably didn't solve all the world's problems in this one in this 90 seconds or so, but hopefully it gives you an idea to just kind of take it with you as we go. Let me just read how Paul ends Romans chapter 12. If your enemy is hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you'll heap burning coals of shame on their heads. Verse 21, do not let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. In my kind of opinion about this, I think the reason that we see a world that's not a peaceful world, because I think the followers of Jesus, we've been so consumed about what we get. And the followers of Jesus, Jesus is asking us to take the message and the power of the gospel wherever we go. And it's not about like keeping what we think is ours, but to take the message of Jesus with us. Instead of looking for ways to divide and to be pushed around, we should just simply offer peace. We should offer this in such a way that it represents Jesus well in this earth, and especially during this season of just crazy busyness. Enjoy the peace, enjoy the offering that Jesus offers to us, and be filled with the Spirit in the sense that we can, wherever we go, we get to offer peace with us. Let's pray. Jesus, thanks for this day. Thanks for everything you've done for us and who you are. God, thank you that you stepped into the mess. You didn't wait for humanity to try to figure this out and then come. You actually stepped into some of the most insane, crazy times. And you brought your peace and you left it here with your disciples. And Jesus, I pray that we would experience that peace ourselves as we fix our eyes on you, and then we also rise above offenses. Jesus, would you allow us to be in step with you? In 2021, as we enter 2022, Jesus, I pray that it gets better, number one. And not just because it and the conditions get better, but as we stay in step with you, we'll stay in step with you and carry your peace with us wherever we go. God, I pray you just watch over us and guide us and allow us to represent you well. And for some of us, we know that this season is just unrest. There's just nothing peaceful about it. God, would you bring your peace in those scenarios? Would your Spirit fill the families and the lives? That some of these events or these seasons are just anything but peaceful. And I pray that your Spirit and your presence would just saturate those families. We love you, Jesus. Continue to pray this. Amen. I want to announce a couple of different things. The weekend after Christmas Eve, we won't have any church. And the week after, the first Sunday of 2022 will be a virtual church as well. We're going to follow that pattern of just keeping that intact. And then we will wrap up Matthew somewhere in January.
No.
We've got like a chapter to go. So we'll see, right? And then we do have another book of the Bible we're going to be studying through. I don't know how long it'll take us to get through that one, but it'll be Ephesians, okay? So, there, yeah. So, say Jude. So, that could be a long one too, who knows? But that being said, guys, I just want, if you need prayer for anything, we'd love to pray with you back in the back, because I don't want you to feel like you need to go through whatever you're going through by yourself. And it's great to be back. So let's go, and let's go be the church. Have a great week. We'll see you next Sunday.